Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we have a presentation on the origins of the Cold War. Our objective is going to be to understand just that. What is the Cold War, and of course, why did it occur? So it's got some deep roots, so let's get at it. The Cold War was between the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. So it wasn't just two countries, it was kind of closer to the world being divided in half. Now, the Cold War was about the Soviet Union versus the United States, certainly, but it was also a battle between communism and capitalism, and totalitarianism and democracy. So the Cold War, many different perspectives about it. But regardless, it's going to divide the world into half. You have the first world and the second world. And the phrase third world countries at that time meant countries that were unaligned, not allied with either one. So why was there so much hate? And make no mistake, there was a lot of hate as part of the Cold War. Well, during World War II, we were, after all, friends. The United States and the USSR were friends. So what happened? How did we screw that up? And we're going to get into it. So now, the major answer to that is the only reason the USA and the USSR were friends was because we had a common enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, and we had Hitler. Hitler was, of course, seen as the worst of two evils, so we allied with the Soviet Union. But as of 1945, Hitler was dead. He was gone. He had committed suicide. The war was over. So we kind of end up going our separate ways, which I suppose we could have predicted. So the Cold War is going to happen. The world is going to be divided in half, but we should understand when, the setting of the situation. So the Cold War starts at kind of an undefined period of time. But if you had to pick a time, you would have to say we transitioned to it after World War II, once Germany was defeated. So, once the Axis powers were gone, it allowed there's no need for our friendship, you could say. So when did the Cold War end? Well, you could say 46 years later. That one's a little more tangible. In 1991, the Soviet Union just literally fell apart, and it broke up into 15 countries. Now, some people say it had been about 5 or 10 or 20 years that the Cold War was cooling, and so slowly we were becoming better friends. But truly, the literal end is when your enemy totally just doesn't exist anymore. And that happened in 1991. So the Soviet Union is going to not exist as 15 countries all withdraw. They leave. Even Russia voted and decided to leave the Soviet Union. So that's why sometimes when people use the word Russia and Soviet Union interchangeably, I always point out that no, the Soviet Union was actually 15 different countries together, and Russia was just one of them. Certainly, Russia had the greatest influence and control out of the group. Now, that said, the Cold War, why was it called the Cold War? And that's because war typically is hot for a lot of obvious reasons. And this war, the United States never fought the Soviet Union, so it never turned literally hot. So why no fighting? Well, I think you could probably say that's because of MAD. And MAD is an acronym that means mutually assured destruction. We basically got to the point where the Soviet Union and the US might have hated each other, feared each other, enough so that would have led to a war in another era. But in this era, both had nuclear weapons. And if you attacked one another, that was going to result in both dying. So, mostly I think nuclear weapons are a terrible, awful thing. But you could make the case that they actually saved us from World War III ever happening. And that's because of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So again, nukes make war a lose-lose situation. So no more world wars, most likely and hopefully. So you could hear this and say, well, we never fought the Soviet Union, so clearly it's no big deal, but it was a big deal. The Cold War was a big deal. And I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why. Problem number one, while we may never have fought the Soviet Union, and by we I mean the United States, we did get involved in proxy wars. So we wouldn't fight each other because of MAD, we talked about that, but the Soviet Union would push China to push other countries into wars with us, and we would fight their proxies. So what do I mean? And the same thing, the United States, of course, would support revolutions against communist leaders and things like that, and we would support those rebel groups. So we both were getting involved in wars, the Soviet Union and the US. It just wasn't literally and directly against each other. Best examples would be the Korean War and the Vietnam War, but there was much more to that. So the Cold War really was a big deal. Lots of wars, lots of fighting, lots of dying. Very sad. So proxy wars were only one of the reasons the Cold War was a really big deal. Another problem was just the fear. Now, I understand fear is an intangible. It's tough to measure and therefore appreciate. But for 50 years or 46, just an endless amount of fearing that you're going to die, that you're going to be nuked, you're going to have wars. And that's worth something. And that's a terrible aspect of the Cold War. So those nukes that existed scared people. And why were they so scary? The answer is, I think this video kind of captures what people thought could happen to them at any moment. And this, of course, is Indiana Jones from one of his movies. And you would think I would be able to play it. So this is Indiana Jones realizing that he's in the middle of a city that's about to experience a nuclear test.
Wait! Sir, great, don't wait for me! Minus 15 seconds. Minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
So the moral of that story is if you're ever getting involved in a nuclear war, just make sure you have a really old fridge that you can hide in. But I mean, that kind of is showing what people were afraid of. The nuclear weapons were going to go off, and that was going to be their home. That was going to be their town, their city, that we were not going to escape, unlike Indiana Jones, I suppose. So again, people were paranoid. They were scared. They were worried. This was a scary time. The United States at this point had enough nuclear weapons to blow up every inch of soil on the earth 3 times over. And I mean, that's a scary fact. And the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons, at least by the early 80s, to blow up every inch of the earth soil by 5 times over. And I mean, that's a devastating time of fear and paranoia. So the world, I mean, the Cold War was awful because of the proxy wars, but also just the endless amount of war. So just kind of for context, in 2021, who else has nukes between these two countries? It's all of these. More specifically, the U.S. had it in 45, the Soviet Union right after them in 49, and then, of course, the UK in 52, and then France in 60, and then China in 62. Israel sometime in the next 20 years, we think. 74, India. Pakistan followed up in 98, and then North Korea in 2006. So even today, Iran is still possibly taking steps towards getting a nuclear weapon. But that's a lot of fear that still exists today, and it was exponentially worse during the Cold War. So as far as quantity of weapons, well, the US and Soviet Union, or should I say Russia today, still have a vast majority of the nuclear weapons that exist. But, you know, it only takes one to create some major damage placed in the right spot. So was this a big deal, the Cold War? And, you know, the proxy wars made it, the massive fear made it. But problem number 3, just the billions of dollars wasted by society on nuclear weapons. The United States before 1953, our size of our military was tiny, relatively so. Before World War II, I think we had the 19th largest military in the world. Now, or army, I should say. Now, during times of war, we would have a draft, and then we would expand our military, the war would end, and our soldiers would go home and back to their lives, truly citizen soldiers. But after 1953, the Soviet Union was just scary with their nuclear weapons and in the Cold War. So the United States committed after the Korean War, the 1953, to our first standing army, a permanent military that can fight a war at any moment. And of course, that is massively expensive. If you look at the discretionary spending that our government has, it has every aspect of life, less money being spent on all of those things than our military. And that, I mean, that is just a lot of money, a very militarized society. And that's the result of the Cold War. more money spent on the military than all other things combined for the U.S. budget. Now, that's a pretty big cost. Now, why would we choose to be in a war that caused proxy wars, massive fear, and massive spending of money? And well, the answer is, well, this presentation. So let's dive in. Let's understand how we got into this situation. So what caused the Cold War? What were the origins of it? And kind of the first thing I want to talk about is a little redundant. Reason number one was just fear of nuclear war. Cycle of fear. We were afraid we were going to get blown up, so we had to prepare for blowing them up. So in 1945, the U.S. invented the nuclear bomb. We talked about this. We dropped it on Japan twice to end that war. 4 years later, the Soviet Union got the nuclear weapon, and now the United States was afraid. What could the Soviet Union do to us, particularly with their leadership, Joseph Stalin and all. And it just seemed inevitable to a lot of people that we were doomed. So an example would be, at school, we did not just fire drills, but duck and cover drills, where students, little kids, elementary students, were taught that they needed to go under their desks in case we ever got nuked by a nuclear bomb. What a depressing concept. Now, the U.S. government put out these posters, Bert the Turtle, basically trying to make little kids feel okay about it. Don't worry, Bert the Turtle, this cartoon he's okay with ducking and covering. Nuclear bombs aren't that bad. I mean, it's such a depressing aspect of society. Here's a government video used to make young children feel okay about the situation.
Dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
Now, you got the gist of it. Basically, we could make fun of the situation by saying there's no way ducking and covering was going to make nuclear weapons acceptable. I mean, literally what it was if a shockwave hit your skull and things started to fall, maybe the desk could protect you from it. But, I mean, trying to make people feel like they could survive a nuclear war was a little bit of a stretch, kind of a joke. So South Park made this video to make fun of the U.S. policy of ducking and covering.
As some people of South Park try desperately to save their mountain town, others look for the missing townspeople. But all must take every precaution necessary.
Okay, people, listen up. As we near the top of the mountain, the chances of our encountering some lava becomes great. Therefore, I have special ordered this training film to assist us in volcano safety. Mr. Garrison, if you would, please.
Harbingers of sorrow, natural disasters can be the cause of troubling and undesirable stress, and the volcano is no exception. But what should you do if a volcano erupts near you or your family? Here we see the Stevens family enjoying a Sunday picnic. But suddenly, Donna hears a noise. It's a volcano. Junior seems worried, but have no fear, Junior. Jane learned in school what to do when you hear a volcano erupt. That's right, Jane. Duck and cover. So what will you do when you hear a volcano erupting? That's right. Duck and cover. Looks like you got the idea. Duck and cover. Thank you, and goodbye.
So that was South Park making fun of the U.S. policy to try to make Americans feel like, don't worry about it. I know we're close to a nuclear war. You'll be fine. Just keep supporting us. Vote for us 2 years from now. So the United States, of course, started digging bomb shelters. A lot of people use these as wine cellars today, but bomb shelters in their backyards, convinced that they could survive a nuclear war. And again, the fear just led to us fully engaging a Cold War, going after the Soviet Union. That's what fear does. So what caused the Cold War? Of course, fear that nuclear war is going to happen. We have to engage the enemy to win it. Reason number two why the Cold War happened was just fear of communism, anger about communism, because the United States had an aversion to socialism and communism. We love our money and we love our homes and our material possessions. But communism basically said the priority is equity, equality. So the United States had a problem with that because we didn't have equity. There was a lot of rich people that owned more than their fair share, some would argue. So the idea is to solve that. Karl Marx came up with a manifesto called the Communist Manifesto, and he said the answer to this was revolution, that the poor people, which should rise up, realize that they outnumber the rich, and take their wealth and create an equal society. Now, that meant the rich people would lose their stuff to everybody that didn't have that money. So, your money would be gone, your home would be gone. So that was Karl Marx's theory about how worldwide socialism or equality would be established. Now, Karl Marx did acknowledge that rich people aren't going to want to give up their property or their money, so instead lock them up or execute them. So the theory of communism, again, was that the poor were going to rise up in violent revolution and take everybody's things, kill them. So the United States was scared collectively as a society. We didn't want a communist revolution where all of their stuff would be taken. That's unfair that our stuff would be taken. So we're communists, right? So this is going to lead to fear, which is going to fuel the Cold War, right? Because the Soviet Union would be behind all of this. Now, were communist revolutions possible, or were we just being a little paranoid? And by 1917, the Soviet Union had been taken over in that, Lenin's revolution. And in 1949, China had been taken over by Mao's revolution, a communist revolution. Both had been conquered. So it does seem possible that communist revolutions can occur. Could it happen in the U.S., or were we paranoid? And the bottom line is rich Americans knew that they were drastically outnumbered by poor Americans. And if poor Americans rose up, like in China or the Soviet Union, they would lose everything. So it was possible. So again, what happened to the Soviet Union in sending people to the U.S. to encourage them to rebel? And that fear is going to lead to the United States committing to a war against communism, right? We got to take it out. It's evil. So what caused the Cold War? Well, fear of nuclear war and who might attack us with it. Fear of communism growing because we despised communism, collectively speaking. Reason number 3, the size of the Soviet Union was also scary. That led to us engaging in a Cold War with them. The USSR is huge, and that inspired fear. If you look, the US is so much smaller, yet we're one of the biggest countries on the planet, yet we're not even close to the country of the Soviet Union that covers 13 time spans, or time zones, I should say. So the US, again, just fearful of war with this gigantic power by land. And that fear is going to result in us saying we have to take it to them. We have to engage them to take them out before they take us out. Now, what caused the Cold War? Fear of nuclear war, fear of communist revolution and communist expansion, fear of the Soviet size. Reason number 4, fear of Russian expansion. So this is kind of an extension of the last one. In recent times, the Soviet Union was contained. It was contained to the west by Germanic tribes, Germanic countries, and the Germanic people in Germany. To the west, the Soviet Union couldn't expand. They kept losing to wars against Germany. To the east, the Soviet Union couldn't really expand because the Japanese had checked its power in recent years. But times had changed. During World War II, Germany and Japan were completely destroyed. There was nobody left. They were ground to powder. They were crushed. They could not contain the Soviet Union anymore. And with nobody left to contain the Soviet Union was going to break free. They were going to expand even more. Except there was one power left, and that was the United States. So the United States traditionally had embraced isolationism, but there was nobody left to contain the Soviet Union and Russia. So point being, the U.S. was going to have to step it up, and step it up we did, out of fear that the Soviet Union was going to keep expanding. Next, what caused the Cold War? Reason number 5, in 1945, the Soviet Union literally took Eastern Europe. Now, Hitler's empire was vast during World War II, but at the end of the war, the United States ended it by invading Western Europe. Now, we liberated Western Europe, we freed it, but then we went home. However, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, invaded Eastern Europe, defeated the Nazis, freed Eastern Europe, sort of. But once they liberated it, they actually kept their troops there and didn't end their occupation. Soviet Union kept troops and decided they wanted friendly governments on Eastern Europe. They needed to ensure that they were made communist and so on. Now, our interpretation in the United States was they had just conquered it. So the Soviet Union did this by outlawing other political parties that were communist, rigging elections, executing government rivals that were against the communists' expanding power. So inevitably, Eastern Europe all turned communist and were ruled by communist governments. Poland, of course, was the most controversial, but all of it was controversial. And the Soviet Union even went as far as to annex Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And that, of course, is going to scare Americans in much of the world. So it turned all of Eastern Europe into puppets. So Harry Truman was angry. Winston Churchill was angry. Now, why? Because we just fought 6 years of war, Winston Churchill said, to defeat Hitler and to free Poland, to free Eastern Europe. And after all of that money and all of those deaths, we just exchanged Hitler for Stalin. So this was terrible. We just fought that war. So, I mean, why did Stalin want Eastern Europe anyway? Well, was it because he was evil? Maybe. Or perhaps, to complicate your thinking, you could look at Russian history and all the deaths that have come from invasions from Western Europe. Napoleon invaded, causing millions of deaths. Germany during World War I caused millions of deaths in the Soviet Union, or should I say Russia. In World War II, the Soviet Union had over 23 million killed because of Hitler's invasion. Stalin was like, never again. I am not doing my job if I ever let the West attack us again. So instead, I need a buffer zone of Eastern Europe. I need to make sure they're friendly governments, communist governments. And if anybody ever invades us, those countries will defend the Soviet Union. The war will be in Eastern Europe. It won't be in the Soviet Union. And therefore, I will protect my people. So perhaps Stalin wasn't entirely evil for what he was doing, but certainly seemed evil as he was conquering and taking freedom away. So conquering Eastern Europe, maybe more so than anything else, led to the Cold War from the U.S. perspective, because we just fought a war to free those areas, and now they were just conquered. And that created a lot of fear in the U.S. that communism was expanding inevitably. So what caused the Cold War? Well, fear of nuclear war, fear of a communist expansion, fear of the Soviet size, fear of Russian expansion, and Eastern Europe being taken, maybe even number one. But reason number 6, in 1945, Hitler was barely hanging on. War was almost over. And that's when the big three met at Yalta to have a conference. Now, at this conference in Yalta, we made some agreements, and one of them had to do with Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union wanted control of Eastern Europe, wanted Eastern Europe put in their sphere of influence. But FDR is going to give his assurances, yes, that can be in your sphere of influence. However, there was a but. The promise was that the Soviet Union could not just conquer them. They had to let them choose their own government, basically have free and unfettered elections. The Soviet Union couldn't mess with their elections. But FDR basically, wink, wink, said, it can be in your sphere. You can ensure that they're friendly governments. So we get this promise, but it's a complicated situation. So either way, the Soviet Union ended up blatantly breaking this promise, and they didn't allow free and unfettered elections. They basically made sure that communist governments took over through some sketchy means, right? Rigged elections, we talked that before. And as they took over Eastern Europe and made them kind of puppets of the Soviet Union, fear is going to spread. Look, the Soviet Union just took over half of Europe. What's going to stop them from taking over the rest of Europe? They certainly had the population greater than Western Europe. So that was the fear. Reason number 7, the Cold War could have originated, is the Iron Curtain speech. If there's any moment where historians say the Cold War started, it was with the Iron Curtain speech. In 1945, the United States had a problem. We were celebrating. We were distracted. We were so happy. World War II was over. Stalin was a hero. He's the one that took down the Nazis. He played a bigger role than the U.S. did in that. So we were excited. Stalin was our partner. Everything was great. Time goes by. And nobody noticed that Stalin had completely solidified his control over Eastern Europe, and that's not good. So in 1946, Winston Churchill travels to the United States with Harry Truman, and he gives a famous speech telling America, you need to wake up. Half of Europe got conquered, and you didn't even notice. Half of the Europe is now controlled by the Soviet Union. And he says that an iron curtain has fallen across Europe, and now Europe is divided. Eastern Europe is conquered. Nobody can get in, nobody can get out, as these two political cartoons demonstrate. So metaphorically speaking, a curtain was chosen because it's casting Eastern Europe forever in darkness, which is not a good thing. So Churchill in the Iron Curtain speech says, the English-speaking peoples of the world come together and fight the Soviet Union. Stalin called it a declaration of war. So, really, the Iron Curtain, this would be the example of the literal Iron Curtain, what was preventing people from escaping these communist countries. So half of Europe had now lost its freedom. If Stalin could conquer half of Europe, the fear was he could conquer the other part of Europe, particularly with the U.S. no longer having its troops there, because certainly Stalin's population dwarfed that of Western Europe. It wouldn't even be a contest with what was predicted. So that led to fear, and that fear is going to lead to the U.S. fully embracing the Cold War. So what's another origin of the Cold War? Reason number 7, just basic threats, dynamics, and attitudes. The United States was particularly harsh when dealing with the Soviet Union. Didn't treat it like an ally. Truman treated the Soviet Union like it was an enemy. And the enemy the Soviet Union would become. It was no longer about compromises and about conflicts they had or being flexible. The United States and the Soviet Union became hostile to each other, and that's going to deteriorate the relationship between the Soviet Union and the U.S. till the point of 1948, where it was an all-out Cold War, right? Now, why did we get to that point where we transitioned from FDR's alliance and ally and being close allies to Truman's enemies with the Soviet Union? And the answer is, well, number one, we remember the Non-Aggression Pact, that Stalin's first choice was to ally with Hitler. In a way, he was just another Hitler. Remember, they started World War II by dividing up Poland and invading it. So Stalin was evil, just like Hitler was. That was the U.S. perspective, another Hitler. Number two, the biggest lesson of World War II was you cannot appease an aggressor. If appeasing or giving an aggressor what they want just makes them more aggressive. So that's what, of course, Chamberlain had done at the Munich conference prior to World War II. We certainly couldn't do it. The Soviet Union was trying to take land, specifically Eastern Europe. We could not just give them threats. We needed to stand up to them. And that's what Truman did. Truman was very, very aggressive at pointing out the Soviet Union was breaking its Yalta promises and that we would come after them if necessary. So our relationship broke, our dynamic was destroyed, and that's going to lead to hostility. And one of the more famous examples was when President Truman met with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and Molotov left saying, "I've never been talked to like that in my life." Truman, of course, responded, "Well, if you keep up your Yalta agreements, you won't have to be talked to like that." And that's going to be the way of things for the next 40 or 50 years, putting that relationship to an all-time low. So what's another origin of the Cold War besides fear of nuclear war, fear of communist expansion, fear of the Soviet size, efforts to stop Russian expansion, Eastern Europe being taken, the Iron Curtain speech, and the fact that we knew we couldn't appease this aggressor? Reason number 8, during World War II, the United States in 1942 knew that the Soviet Union was hurting, absolutely hurting. They were under attack from the Nazis, from Germany, and they were getting crushed. And then Stalin said, "I'm getting crushed. The only way I can survive is if Britain and the U.S. form a second front on Germany. If you invade in France, German-held France." And of course, the U.S. at this point said, "No, that would be too difficult. We can't do that. That would lead to too many American and British lives being lost. It's not possible." So instead, we delayed D-Day somewhat on purpose and instead attacked North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And it wasn't until 1944 that we actually attacked France. So Soviet Union was begging, and they knew that we had turned our back on them, and they had millions of Soviet soldiers dead. They took the full brunt of Germany's power, and they never forgot that. And if you look at World War II deaths, this was kind of the evidence of that. If you look at how many people the United States lost, nearly 300,000 people, it was dwarfed by the number of people that the Soviet Union lost. And the Soviet Union will never forget that. Stalin really felt the U.S. had turned its back on them and was a true enemy of them. So another example of why the origins of the Cold War was the Russian Revolution during World War I. Germany had a two-front war. France and British attacked it from the west, Russia from the east. But Germany was crushing Russia. And the Russians were so unhappy with the war. The Russian Revolution occurred in the middle of World War I, basically getting close to knocking Russia out of the war. So the Russian Revolution occurred. Believe it or not, a second revolution occurred right after that, and communism took over Russia. Now, the United States was upset with this for lots of reasons, and ultimately committed 13,000 troops to invading Russia, in large part to support the White Army of Russia, or the anti-Bolsheviks. And our troops and our Navy clashed with Bolshevik troops, as did much of the Allied powers. And the Soviet Union, and out of all those battles and contests, the Soviets and the communists and Lenin, and then later Stalin, and even a guy named Khrushchev, all remembered that when the communist revolution was in an infancy stage, the very youngest it could be, the United States invaded to basically squash it. And even though it was much more complicated than that, that would prove to be the propaganda and the storyline that the Soviets would always tell, making their people very upset at the Soviet Union. So what caused, or what were the origins of the Cold War and all that fear and resentment? Yellow journalism played its own role in the United States. Newspapers wanted to make money, and the way that you make money and sell newspapers is to have flashy stories and flashy headlines of exaggerated problems. So, we would see images like this, basically saying, is communism going to take over? Is our life going to be destroyed? It could happen at any moment. Communism is coming to destroy our country. I mean, if you looked at these images every day, you of course would be like, we have to elect people that are going to do everything possible to destroy the Soviet Union before they destroy us. So that type of yellow journalism is going to influence our government, those that got elected, and all of the American people, that we need to basically become more militarized and go after the Soviet Union. So yellow journalism played that role. Demagoguery played that role. Now, the problem with democracy, and I love democracy, but the problem with it is in order to get elected, you need to convince people that they need you. And the best way to make the American people vote for you and think that they need you is to make the American people fearful and needy, because only you can save them. And demagoguery is a way to do that. Now, we talked about demagoguery before, but the number one characteristic of a demagogue is they don't appeal to get votes based on reason or ideas. More often than not, they try to scare the hell out of people. And then that's when those people will depend on the demagogue, on that elected official. So you scare them, you make them angry, and their emotions lead to them voting for you rather than rational thought. And that's what happened in the United States. It was basically a race to become, it was basically, if you wanted to get elected, you had to really, really emphasize that we were going to get killed any moment by the Soviet Union and that you would be tougher on the Soviet Union than them. And that type of fear made that possible. Another origin of the Cold War from the US perspective was red baiting. Again, if any politician, as an extension of the last one we talked about, if any politician said that, well, you know what, communists, they're not that bad. These fears are exaggerated. Stop being so afraid. They would immediately be a victim of red baiting. People would accuse them of being weak, soft on communism, and they would lose because there's no way we're electing somebody who's going to get us all killed by being soft on communism. Those people would be shamed out of office. And eventually we would end up with an entire legislature, including a president, that all were racing as much as possible to become as anti-communist as possible. And if you were soft on communism or even rational or moderate about the Cold War, you would lose your election. You could not survive. So you had to be as anti-communist as possible, no choice about it. So again, hawks would dominate the Cold War era. Everybody else would be shamed out of office as being weak. So what caused the Cold War? Oh, a lot of things. I'm even going to throw out one or two more. Confirmation bias. So if you look at this image, what exactly is it? Now, you could say it's a vase, or you could say it's two humans looking at each other. It's both. So what you see totally depends on your point of view, your paradigm, the lens that you're using, right? So U.S. thoughts on the Soviet Union during the Cold War were completely biased by confirmation bias. We thought that the Soviet Union was evil because that's what the press and our politicians and the demagogues were telling us. So because we were living in a moment of hate and fear, we had a biased paradigm, which is basically a biased way to look at all the information about the world. We would filter out anything that made the Soviet Union look innocent, and we would just double down on everything that made them look bad. So let's take, for example, all things being equal, every country, including the Soviet Union, does plenty of good things and plenty of bad things. But because of our fear and our paradigm, we would only see the bad things because we interpreted everything they did through our fear and then assumed the worst. So that's confirmation bias, where you don't pay attention to things that don't agree with the way you look at the world. You only pay attention to things that make sense of what you already think. And that's what we did. So every time the Soviet Union did something like trying to establish power in Eastern Europe, we thought they were trying to conquer the world. We didn't necessarily look at it as a way for them to defend themselves from future invasions. Not that that was perfectly a good idea, but it certainly was a better perspective, or slightly less bad. So again, lots of reasons why the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War. And this isn't an exhaustive study, but it certainly handles a lot of the reasons why the Cold War happened and why we were so afraid of each other and fearful. So look for your assignment in Google Classroom.